So, good afternoon, everybody. Today, last day of class, and I will continue on our lecture about international migration. So just go back there to the slides, and I was talking about the economic effects of immigration. And I'm like mentioning that still there is no agreement among researchers, economists, social scientists about what are the effects of immigration, usually low-skilled immigration, on the labor outcomes of US-born population, if you're talking specific about the US. And I mentioned this report here in the last class that has extensive analysis from researchers from several areas. And the report is about the integration of immigrants into the American society, but there is a whole section related to the economic effects of immigrants in the US. And I said that there are different effects. Some researchers mentioned that there is a negative effect of immigrants on their earnings and on employment rates of US-born workers, and others don't see that negative effect. And I also mentioned the work by David Card, in which he actually said that a lot of these differences that researchers find, it's related to different methodological procedures, so different methodologies that people use in their research. And his main point is that we should take into account that immigrants, when they arrive in a specific country, they will compete for jobs, but they will also increase the demand for to buy food, to rent a house, to buy a house, to buy cars, and so on. So companies in that country will increase production, and by increasing production, it will hire more people. In that case, he says that when we consider that companies respond to an increase in demand, not just a supply of workers, we don't see a negative effect of immigration on labor outcomes of the US-born population. And he also mentioned that we should use only two groups of education, because when you go out there to try to get a job, you are viewed as either someone who has a high school diploma or not, or that you have a college degree diploma or not. And also, you have to take into account that low-skilled immigrants and low-skilled US-born people, they are not the same in the labor market. Because low-skilled immigrants, still, they usually don't have good knowledge of English. They have much smaller social network. So although they might get some really low-paying jobs with higher chances that the low-skilled US-born people, low-skilled US-born people can then move to better work opportunities because they know English and they know more people or more opportunities of jobs. And in this paper here, I mean, the paper is from 2006, but the data is already outdated. It's from 1997, but it's one way to try to understand what's the long-term fiscal impact of immigrants. And these numbers here are calculated for each, for each immigrant, so on an average among immigrants, and the numbers here are in thousands. So it's pretty much saying that immigrants without a high school degree, they usually have a negative effect on the fiscal outcomes of the country where they move to. And this is based on data for the US. So pretty much saying that immigrants here, from data from 1997, they actually get 89,000 more from the country than contribute to the country. So this number here is a net number, so it can be positive or negative. And these descendants are pretty much the second generation immigrants. So here's the first generation, the ones that were born outside of the US and came here. Descendants, they were born in the US, but their parents were born outside. And But when you kind of like look for immigrants and first and second generation immigrants with higher levels of education, then you start to see that they contribute more to the country than what they use from the country, right? So there is a positive balance for all the subgroups. And if we take all these groups together, you could, you see that pretty much you have a really small negative effect of immigrants as a whole and positive effects of descendants and the total effect. But you could still make the argument, oh, exactly this is what we are trying to avoid, this negative effect on the fiscal capacity of the country of immigrants with low levels of education. But here, this is an overall picture, not controlling for anything else. And what I'm going to show you in this next slide is a discussion of like how exactly these immigrants here compared to US-born people with low levels of education, how they affect each other's labor outcomes. So something that I mentioned in the previous slides, natives, US-born people experience occupational grading and specialization as an adjustment to immigration flows. And I mean, whenever you are looking at this literature about the effects of immigration on the labor outcomes of US-born people, a lot of these papers use the term natives. Natives, I'm not just talking about Native Americans, I'm talking about people born in the US, US-born people. And what these studies show is that when you have a large inflow of low-skilled immigrants into the US or also in other countries, these studies were also debating, when you have that, you low-skilled US-born workers, they kind of move on and get better job opportunities. While immigrants tend to concentrate on manual jobs due to language and cultural limitations, US-born workers leave their previous occupations to work on more complex jobs. So, and of course, here we are talking more about low-skilled immigrants and low-skilled US-born workers. And this pattern generates improvements in native wages and mobility without negative effects on unemployment for low-skilled US-born workers. So it's pretty much saying that maybe in the short term, there is a competition between low-skilled immigrants and low-skilled US-born workers. But in the medium long term, these low-skilled US-born workers, they move on and they actually experience an increase on earnings and actually in unemployment rates as well. And here, doing studies not only about the US, Perry and his colleagues show that countries with larger immigrant competition experience a move of native workers to more sophisticated skills with higher incomes, which require higher education levels. So of course, if you have low-skilled workers in these countries, born in these countries, and they are already older, and then they experience some competition from low-skilled immigrants, they might lose those jobs, and then they cannot move to other jobs because these other jobs will require higher levels of education. But even here in the US, when we talk about the problems like in terms of employment that we see in Midwestern states, in that case, because of automation and everything, a lot of factories that were, for example, producing cars, they closed their jobs, but that's not related to immigration. That's much more related to automation in these places. And a lot of those people that were working manufacturing and receiving good jobs, they had to move to other jobs, like in the service industry. And in the service industry, they would make on average lower earnings. But though that issue that we saw, and we still are seeing Midwestern states, and that population tends to be older, the ones that were affected by that, they are, of course, not willing to go back and to do training because of the phase in their life, but that process of them losing their jobs is not related to the discussion that we are doing here about immigrants entering and competing for those jobs. Also because those jobs in manufacturing did require higher skills. They were not for lower skilled workers. But when we hear a lot of this debate, we usually see this anti-immigration feeling from these states that are losing jobs because of lack of jobs in manufacturing, but that's not related to immigration per se. It's related to another subject that has to do with automation, or even to these kind of companies moving overseas, but usually much more related to automation than anything else. Natives engage in entrepreneurship. And one other thing, in the case of low-skilled workers, when low-skilled immigrants arrive to the countries, and this study has been done for several countries, low-skilled natives, those born in those countries, they will tend to have higher chances of being entrepreneur, open their own businesses in response to this larger immigrant competition. And these activities, they will make more money than they were doing before. Of course, it's more risky, but they move up in the socioeconomic scale. And usually open immigration policies tend to generate better career opportunities for natives when combined with flexible labor markets, in the sense that the labor market should be open to immigrants, so immigrants don't stay only in the informal labor market. The opportunities for these two groups should be the same, because then natives would have chances to work on other activities that would be improvement overall in their lives. Modules, exactly with the same authors, Ottaviano and Perry, mentioned that these immigration modules should take into account the skill of workers and capital to assess the effect of immigration on the wages of native workers in the long run. What is this talking about? It's related to that discussion, the methodological discussion that David Carr just did in that previous slide, one of the previous slides that I just showed. When we try to see the effect of low-skilled immigration on the labor market outcomes of low-skilled, let's say, US-born workers, we should, of course, compare people with similar levels of skills. In this case, usually a way to measure skill is by educational attainment. We talked before, those with high school diploma, without high school diploma, and with a college degree diploma. But the models should, first compare people with similar levels of skills, similar levels of education. But this comparison of people with similar levels of skills, it's only the direct effect of the competition of people that are looking for similar jobs. The models also should take into account that investments from businesses increasing capital could also be affected. Exactly what I said before. Immigrants, when they enter a country, they will look for jobs, so they compete for jobs, but they will also buy, they will also consume products in that country, and that stimulates local businesses to increase production, and by increasing production, you have more jobs and more wealth, right? So the total wage effect is also determined by indirect complementarities among different types of immigrants and natives. So we have to take into account, compare people with similar levels of skills of education, but also know that there is this indirect effect exactly because the demand for products increase, and then businesses start have incentives to invest more capital. Overall, their study shows that immigration to the US, controlling for all these different effects, had a modest negative long-run effect on real wages of the least educated natives. Also controlling for changes in capital by business and everything, they find that the effect varied between -2% to +1.7%. So this confidence interval here, 0 is in the middle there of minus 2.1 and plus 1.7, kind of showing that this result is not statistically significant, different than 0. So the effect of low-skilled immigrants on the wages of low-skilled US-born workers is actually 0, because this interval comprises 0, okay? But as I said before, that report funded by the National Academies of Science, they mentioned that this debate is not settled, it's still open, because there are so many confounding factors that explain why unemployment increases or decreases, why people have higher or lower earnings. That varies even by the month of the year. So it's just hard to control for everything. So social scientists are always trying to find some examples, some things that happen in the world that they cause really sudden changes from one time to the other that you are not expecting. And those changes might affect exactly the outcomes that you are concerned about. So for example, let's say that you collected a survey in Central America. And then 2 months later, there is a hurricane or an earthquake. That event that just happened after you collect the survey, it's really, really bad to the population, of course, but gives you the chance to collect data after that happened. And then you can compare the socioeconomic, the health, educational outcomes of people before and after that event. And those events that happen suddenly, not expected, and then you have data from before and you have data from after, those events are called natural experiments. So social scientists use a lot this kind of methodology, something that happened really sudden and you were not expecting, and you have data from before, and then you continue collecting data and you can compare this data from before and after. In this specific case of how immigration flows might affect the outcomes, the labor outcomes of US-born people, this Mariel boat lift event, it's a really good natural experiment to see whether large inflows of immigrants, they might cause negative effects on the labor outcomes of US-born workers. So what exactly was this Mariel boat lift? For a few months in 1980, around 125,000 low-skilled immigrants entered Miami from Mariel Bay in Cuba. Pretty much, I mean, for several decades, because of the embargo against Cuba, Cuba has a lot of issues economically, and a lot of Cubans want to come to the US, and the Cuban government doesn't let them move here. But in 1980, for a few months, Fidel Castro was like, okay, guys, you want to go, and the American government is making all this pressure, just go. So it was a huge political move that Fidel Castro did at that time. And he said, no, anybody who wants to go, go. And what happened with that? The workforce of Miami rose by 8% in a few months, exactly because of that Fidel Castro lifted Cubans' ban on immigration. The normal immigration to the US usually increases the workforce in the country by about only 0.3% per year. And here, in a few months, you had 8% increase of the workforce in Miami. So if immigrants compete with native workers and they have negative effects on the earnings and labor outcomes of native workers, this example here, the Mariel boat lift event in the 1980s, is exactly where we want to see where the earnings of natives dropped after this huge increase of immigrants in the area. So if immigrants do compete for jobs with low-skilled natives, and low-skilled natives experience a drop on earnings and also increases unemployment, what you would expect is that after 1980s, the earnings of native workers would drop below the levels that was already dropping. And this economist here, Clemens, he organized this article. That's an article published in this online. It's an online article. It's not completely academic in the sense that's not peer reviewed, but he does a really, really interesting job of kind of summarizing several different methodologies and explaining step by step the different methodologies that were used by different economists. So I pretty much took from his article here, so this was published in 2017, and he mentions like debates that were being done recently, and he even mentions the previous US Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, citing the work by Jorge Borges, that Jorge Borges said that immigrants have a negative effect on the labor outcomes of US-born people. And then he shows why some people have, some economists find positive effects and some don't, and some find negative effects. So here, he pretty much uses data from the same data source, the current population survey, and implements a series of different estimates based on previous economists, their strategies. So he used the strategies from Jorge Borges, that professor from Harvard, David Card, Perry, David Card from Berkeley, and he estimates that and goes step by step showing what are the results. So I got these graphs exactly from here, okay? So you can check this website afterwards. I didn't put everything here in my slides, but you can read this article afterwards.
What questions from the exam be pulled from this article?
Sorry?
What questions on the exam be pulled from this article?
It can be pulled from the portions that I discussed in the lecture here. So you don't have to read the whole article, but you have to understand the graphs that I'm gonna show you to you now here. Okay? So what he did, so this economist, Clemens, he just replicated the work from previous economists and using their methodologies and try to see what happened and looking for data in Miami at that time. And he first mentions that David Card from Berkeley in 1990 found no difference in wage or employment trends between Miami and other cities. This was true for workers even at the bottom of the skill ladder, even for workers with really, really low levels of education. The employment trends did not change much if you compare Miami and other cities. The Marielle immigration had essentially no effect on the wages or employment outcomes of non-Cuban workers in the Miami labor market. On the other hand, Jorge Borges, in a book from 2016, found that the influx of immigrants in Miami dramatically reduced the wages of US-born workers. And as I just showed you in the article in that website, the previous administration, the previous federal administration here in the US, used that finding from Jorge Borges as a way to criticize immigration and say, okay, we now know that immigration has negative effects on earnings. And this work that that's a book called We Wanted Workers that was published back in 2016. And it's cited at the end of this lecture here. And Jeff Sessions even cited this work and other people from the previous administration, right? So what Clemens is going to try to do is to estimate with the same data set that all these economists uses, which is the current population survey, back from the 1980s, Miami, and implement different methodologies to see what the results are. So the first thing that he does, so exactly using data from around the 1980s, from the current population survey. Current population survey, it's collected every month, and it's a survey that on American households and has a lot of information on labor market outcomes. And it's conducted by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and the US Census Bureau also work with them. And in this case here, what we are looking at? We are looking at the overall trends of wages, right? Comparing the wages of each one of these years here with the wage in 1979. 1979 here equals 0, and the wages in these other years here are comparing to 1979. So what we saw, only looking at people with low skill, what are low skill? Those with high school or less, in Miami for those years. What we saw is that comparing to 1979, earnings, they were higher in previous years. And these dotted lines here, they show the confidence interval, kind of showing that this is a linear trend, that the black dotted line in the back here, or dashed line, and this one's here is the upper estimate in our confidence interval, and here the lower estimate. Kind of showing that if this dashed line in the back falls in between these two dotted lines here, there is no significant variation over time. Since this is a survey provides us estimates that try to be representative to the population. We can make mistakes. That's why we always work with this margin of error, in this case represented by these confidence intervals, right? Margin of error is the same thing that we always hear when we have election polls, as well, that candidate is expected to receive 45% of the votes, but that can vary between 40 and 50%. Same thing as here, because election polls and this survey are based on samples, not on the census of the population. And what do you see? After the 1980, after this huge influx of immigrants, low-skilled immigrants from Cuba in Miami, if that hypothesis that low-skilled immigrants, they affect in a negative way the earnings of low-skilled US-born workers, we would expect this red line to drop even further. I mean, earnings were already dropping even before 1980. They were already dropping for other reasons, macroeconomic reasons. But now in 1980, we experienced this huge inflow of immigrants. These macroeconomic reasons are still going on there now, but what we see is exactly the opposite. With this huge inflow of immigrants, the earnings of the native population kind of stops declining so much as it was doing before in the 1980s. And if we look at the confidence interval, it's actually above, not touching this linear trend here. So kind of like see the opposite effect, as some of the researchers would say, that actually this huge influx of immigrants, low-skilled immigrants in Miami, did not affect the earnings of these low-skilled US-born workers in a negative way. Otherwise, what we should have seen was this red line dropping below this trend here. And look that by looking at the earnings of this specific group, we have information. We have 185 people in our sample per year between 1983 and 1987. So that's our sample size here. But he goes on and says, okay, let's do some other estimates for other subgroups of the population to see if for other subgroups, we see some negative effects. See if these trends here, they become even lower than it was before. So here he subdivides these workers into the only male workers, only Hispanic workers, non-Cubans, and only those between 25 and 59. This is more like the prime age in the labor market, usually where you have higher earnings of workers. When you look at males only, again, there is no sign of a dip in low-skilled Miami wages for all these subgroups. For male workers, actually improved a little bit and then came back to the same level, because now we see the confidence interval here touching the previous trend that we had. For only Hispanics, no Cubans, not considering Cubans, because we want to see the effect on other subgroups of the population. Again, the trend actually got better, and in the more recent years in this analysis here, actually does not even touch the previous trend. So the earnings of this subgroup actually increased by 1987. And for the same group, for the prime year age group, after 1980, the Mariel boat lift event, actually the earnings of these people improved after that event. And this is the sample size for each one of these subgroups, kind of showing how many people do we have on the current population survey in this specific city, in this specific subgroup per year, right? So that's the 89, 61 observations per year, 142 observations per year. And if we break that first slide, we had 185 observations getting together, people with high school or less. Let's divide those with less than high school and those with high school. So the 185 are divided into two subgroups, high school only and less than high school. Even when you look at these subgroups, when you look at high school only, actually, the negative trend actually improved. So the earnings of these people here got better comparing to their earnings back in 1979. And for those with less than high school, because you could say, oh, people with less than high school, they are going to be the ones severe impacted here because they have really low levels of education. But the trends, the negative trends from before do not differ from the negative trends that you see after the Mariel boat lift. See the confidence interval here touching that dashed line in the back. So even for the ones that are really low skilled in Miami, their earnings did not experience a negative, a further negative drop because of the inflow of immigrants. So no sign of a dip in low skilled Miami wages, even when we divide workers on high school or less than high school. And then we can do the same exercise that Borges did. Borges said, no, you have to look at this data, but you have to look at the effect in a specific subgroup of the population. What's that specific subgroup of the population that Borges mentioned? Those are male, non-Hispanic, between 25 and 59 years of age, and less than high school. So Borges criticized those previous estimates by saying that we are looking at a group that's not the one that's affected by the inflow of immigrants. According to him, the subgroup that would be affected by the huge inflow of immigrants is this one here. But in order to get into this group here, he pretty much has to throw away 91% of the data from CPS, from the current population survey. When you throw away such a high percentage of data from a sample, that sample loses a lot in terms of representativeness for the whole population. But what are the findings here? For this specific subgroup, you had a negative trend of their earnings over time, not so negative as the other groups, but it had a negative trend. But after the Mariel boat lift, then you see a really dip in their earnings of this specific subgroup of the population in Miami. And then his argument is like, this group here, and you see these lines are not, the confidence interval here is not touching the previous trend. Then he arguments that the Mariel boat lift, huge inflow of immigrants affected negatively the earnings of the US-born workers. But for that specific subgroup, that he throw away a lot of data, and then you lose a lot of representativeness of your sample. So the major issue here in this analysis that Borges provides, and it's kind of, that's the argument of these other economists, is that his sample size is too small to make any reasonable inference from this data here. He has only 17 people per year between 1983 and 1987 with these characteristics here. So the sample size is too small. So his analysis, it's not really robust. It's not really convincing. It's not really representative to the whole country, right? So this whole debate about immigration affecting earnings of the population, and as I mentioned before, his book was mentioned a lot by the previous administration. And of course, Jorge Borges is a professor, economics professor in Harvard. They said, oh, his work showed negative effects of immigration on the earnings of low-skilled workers. But it doesn't go in detail into what exactly he did, and these estimates are not robust enough because of lack of a representative sample. But of course, the general public doesn't hear this detailed explanation or read this kind of article to understand that's a problem of the methodology, okay? So that's what we have to be concerned whenever we make these arguments against immigration or against any kind of policy without understanding the analysis of it, not just citing a professor from a well-known university without actually going deep and understanding the methodology. Okay? There is one question in the chat. We've got only assignment 3 and the final exam left. Yes, that's correct. Assignment 3, I already posted the guidelines for assignment 3 some weeks ago, and it's already open for submission. One person before class had already submitted. And the final exam is going to be on this coming Tuesday, May 4th, and it's going to be open as the previous exams from 1 to 8 p.m. But the difference now is that you're going to have, once you open the exam, you can, you have 2 hours and 30 minutes to complete it. Yes, the final is on Tuesday. I'm just following the university calendar. So the syllabus here, it's the information there. The final exam, 20 points on May 4th, Tuesday. And if you go back to this page here, the final exam will begin on Canvas from 1 to 8. Okay? And information about the exams, you can also go to this file here. The link is in the syllabus. And you see that the final exam has 40 multiple choice questions. You have 2 hours and 30 minutes to answer. And it's going to give you an average of 3 minutes and 45 seconds to answer each one of the 40 questions. Okay? And assignment 3, it's due at noon on Tuesday. And that's also, that information is also available in the course website. If you look at the instructions of assignment 3 is due at noon on May 4th, and then 1 hour later at 1 p.m., you can already open the final exam to start doing it, but it can be anytime between 1 and 8, right? But remember, try to open it at least 2 hours and 30 minutes before 8 p.m. so you have the full time to answer. Cool. So the last portion of this lecture about international migration, there is a debate also in the US that maybe the US should implement a new immigration system in a way that we should try to get the more high-skilled immigrants to the country. So the previous administration was highlighting that a lot, was highlighting that we should do a merit-based immigration policy in similar ways that Canada has. So we should try, have immigrants coming to the country, but focusing or giving higher chances of immigrants with higher levels of education to move to the country. So a criticism of the US immigration policy is that the admissions are not based on a selection of the best and the brightest. More high-skilled immigration is needed to raise educational attainment of the labor force. So the previous administration and some policymakers mentioned that we should actually bring more well-educated people from abroad, and then that will increase educational distribution in the country. But this logic, this hypothesis here is not sustained when we consider that immigrants and children of immigrants, they improve their education levels. So immigrants, they might come here with lower levels of education than the average American population, but their children, once they are born here, or even if they arrived here early enough and then go through the education system, they will experience better levels of education later in life. And there is a relatively small number of immigrants compared with the whole population to actually make a difference on the education distribution of the country by focusing on these high-skilled immigrants that will not actually increase the overall educational attainment distribution of the population, because overall the number of immigrants is not so high to make that impact. And this paper here that I'm showing to you was just published this last year, and it's available in the IUSSP website. IUSSP is the International Union for the Scientific Study of Population. It's kind of the most important international demographic association. Here in the US, you have PAA, the Population Association of America, and their meeting will happen just this coming week. And so this article here, I got information from it exactly from the IUSSP. So just comparing the US and the Canadian immigration systems, the US system does not select immigrants primarily on their educational skills. We have immigrants coming here to the US because they have family ties to all the Americans who are already here. Some of them are fleeing political persecution from their home country. We also have the green card lottery that provides the chance of people getting permanent residence in the US. And of course, as we talked before, we have unauthorized workers. Nowadays, they come in more as visa overstayers than those ones that are entering without inspection. On the other hand, the Canadian immigration system is based on the point system. It gives priority to highly educated immigrants. So around 60% of Canadian immigrants have a college degree, while only 30% of US immigrants have a college degree. And here we're talking about foreign-born, people born outside of Canada, people born outside the US. We are not considering second-generation immigrants. So 60% and 30% only with a college degree among foreign-born workers in Canada and the US. So there are some propositions that came out in this last year here in the US. US policymakers have debated implementing a point system as in Canada. And this RAISE Act of 2017 did not pass, but the idea was that this act would have eliminated certain family categories from the immigration visa system here in the US. It would have ended the lottery program, and it would have required employment-based immigrants to enter either with a combination of high levels of education, English proficiency and earnings, or with extraordinary accomplishments or wealth. So they were trying to base immigration to the US only of people with high levels of education, high levels of proficiency in English, and high levels of earnings, and of course, focusing on rich people to move to the US. Okay? But how much, like that first thing that these people that are in favor of this change in the policy, how much the educational attainment of the working age population will change over time the next decades? How much will that be? If US immigrants were as educated as Canadian immigrants, if we had immigrants here that overall had those really high levels of college degree, as in Canada, how much educational attainment of the working age population would change? Or on the other hand, how much would it change if unauthorized immigration or family and diversity admissions categories were eliminated? So what this study does here is a series of simulations, kind of does what policymakers should have done before they propose their policies. Do a study, analyze data, right? So they do simulations, trying to see if the US immigration system changed into the point system as Canada, how would that change the educational attainment of the US population? And if those different categories of immigrants change over time, if we were able to block all unauthorized immigrants to come to the US, if we eliminated family and diversity admission categories, what would happen to the educational attainment of the US population? So these authors, they do a series of microsimulation models. And to do these simulations, whenever you do simulations, you're trying to project what would happen in the future. But simulations, they make sense only if you build some scenarios that are plausible for that society that you are analyzing. So what these authors try to do, they try to be really careful, is that these microsimulation models account for the ways that Americans live their lives. And they try to think how those changes might happen in the next years, so they are able to make these projections from 2015 to 2065. So it simulates immigration scenarios while assuming that all the aspects of their life in America will continue similar to current conditions. Here in the US, we see a lot of educational mobility. Usually, children of immigrants, children of low-skilled immigrants, they improve their earnings on average, and children of high-skilled immigrants, they decline their earnings on average. So what happens is that immigrants that come here in the US with high levels of education, their children tend to see a decline on educational attainment. And those immigrants that come here with low levels of education, their children on average see an increase because they are tending towards the average educational attainment of the US population. So they use the same trends of educational mobility, both upward and downward. They also take into account immigration assimilation. And as we saw in previous debates in this lecture, this process of immigrant assimilation or immigrant integration also happens in different ways by race ethnicity groups. There is a lot of inequality in terms of race ethnicity in the US. And I don't know if I mentioned that specifically clearly, but the term, usually now demographers and social scientists are using more the term immigrant integration instead of just immigrant assimilation, because immigrant assimilation gives us the idea that immigrants will assimilate the culture here in the US or their host country. But what happens in an immigration process is that immigrants learn the culture from the host society, but the host society is also influenced by the culture of immigrants. So there is much more an interaction there of both sides learning from each other. So that's why instead of just saying immigrant assimilation, that just gives us this impression of being one way, we use the term immigrant integration. So the US immigrant education, with the current policy, doing projections, doing simulations to the next decades, exactly following those strategies that I just showed in the previous slide, if we keep having the same policy as we have now, with the green card lottery, family reunion, people fleeing political persecutions, unauthorized immigration, 52% of immigrants and their descendants, age 25 and 64, would have a college degree by 2065. Again, looking at this specific age group here, 25 to 64, because this is usually the prime age group in the labor market, those making more money. Another simulation. Let's keep those same scenarios of educational mobility, of immigrant integration and racial inequality, but let's make a simulation in which immigrants entering the US now have the same high levels of education as immigrants entering Canada. So if the US was under the Canadian model, this percentage of 52 would increase to 67 in the US by 2065. And of course, this should not be surprising because Canada explicitly selects immigrants on education. So you would have this increase from 52 to 67%. What about the other categories? If we were able to eliminate unauthorized migration, and eliminating, as we discussed before, unauthorized immigration in the US, it's not through constructing or increasing border security in the south of the US. That's not efficient. That's just a waste of money. You would have to deal with visa overstayers, people that come here to stay for a short period of time and they stay longer, and that is harder to control. But let's say, let's say that we eliminate all unauthorized immigrants coming to the US. That would cause, by 2065, an increase in the share of the population with a college degree by just 3%. So you would have this massive effort from the government and a lot of money being invested to, by the end, increase the proportion of the percentage of the population with a college degree only by 3% by 2065. What about if we eliminated family and diversity immigrants? That would increase the share of people with college degree in this specific subgroup here, 25 to 64, by 2065, only by 1%. So, because these family-based and diversity immigrants, they are nearly as educated as employment-based immigrants. So that would not actually change much the overall share of people with at least a college degree in the US, if that is really the reason why you are trying to implement that policy, right? And another thing that we have to take into account is educational mobility, what I mentioned before. Even if immigrants arrive with little education, their children tend to improve their overall educational attainment on average. On the other hand, as I said, children of immigrants that come here with high skill or really high levels of education, you see the opposite trend. You see a downward trend in educational outcomes. 73% of immigrants and their descendants would have college degree in 2065 if they retain parents' education. So let's say there is no educational mobility. Let's say that lowest skilled workers with low levels of education that come here, immigrants with low levels of education that come here, let's say that their children in the future will have the same low levels. And immigrants that come here with high levels of education, their children will have the same high levels of education. That overall, 73% of immigrants and their descendants would have college degree in 2065 if they retain their parents' education, because you are maintaining the ones that have lower education low and maintaining the ones that have high education high. their children. But what's the reality in the US? This is not the reality in the US. That's not a plausible simulation. That's not a simulation that provides us a real scenario for the future. Because in the US, we have education mobility. Children of immigrants that come here with high levels of education, on average, they decline, and the other way from the bottom to the top. So if we take into account downward and upward mobility of education of children compared to their parents, the overall percentage of those with college degree in 2065 in the US would be 67%. So instead of 73, would be 67. Education attainments of descendants of immigrants tend to drift toward the average attainments of the whole population. So that's what I was saying. These people that are declining, the children that have education levels lower than their parents, and the ones that have education levels that are higher than their parents, they are just leaning towards the average of the US born population. And that's more of a reality. And that reality, if we do this simulation, we would get 67% of the population with a college degree by 2065. If we make a scenario that has no base on how the American society works, it would be higher, but only by 6%, right? But this simulation here is not plausible to actually happen because we do have educational mobility. So does the US receive enough immigrants to change the entire US labor force? Immigrants and their descendants, so first immigration immigrants and first generation immigrants and second generation immigrants, make up only 20% of the projected population in the US by 2065. This proportion is too small to have an overall impact in terms of educational attainment in the country. Younger people who tend to have more education will replace older, less educated workers in the country. And second generation immigrants, overall, they will see improvements on their earnings, improvements on their education levels. Impacts of eliminating unauthorized immigration or family reunification and diversity categories on the entire working age population would be virtually zero in terms of educational attainment. So these policies, this analysis pretty much showing that these policies would not be efficient. It would maybe prevent groups from different cultural backgrounds to come to the US, but in terms of educational attainment, that would not improve the US. And the educational attainment improvement, that's the reason that policymakers are using to implement that policy. If their intention is to retain people from other cultural backgrounds to come, that maybe could work, but that's not what they at least are saying in public, right? Because that, of course, would be racist. So immigration shape American society. What I just said, inflows of immigrants will change the composition in terms of race ethnicity of the American society, will change the culture of the American society. I just said about immigrant integration. Immigrants, they learn the American culture, but they also influence changes in the American culture. But this is not the reason why these policymakers are saying, as I said before, they would not use this because that would be completely racist. And the argument that they are using is that they want to increase educational composition, educational attainment of the whole population. But education is similar across existing classes of immigrants. The mobility among children on immigrants means that their education drifts both upward and downward, as I mentioned, I have been mentioned now here. Children of immigrants, the majority of them improve their education, but also we have the downward mobility. Migration represents a small annual net flow relative to the total population. So stopping those specific visa categories, opportunities to move to the US is not actually going to change education composition in the country. Cool. So that was the lecture about international migration. Yeah, the paper the book by Borges, the 2016 is this one here. And the paper that I mentioned by Card is here. And also that work by Perry. So all these different papers here are compressed in the zip file available in the course, in our course website. And this long report funded by the National Academies of Science, the integration of immigrants into the American society. As I showed in the previous class, you can just Google it and download the report. And as I said, it's more than 500 pages long. It goes really in detail there. Now here, I will just mention really quickly in this last 15 minutes about the lecture on race ethnicity that will have been the next chapter. And here in the race ethnicity chapter, I start this lecture by showing how classification of race ethnicity changed over time in the US, in the censuses. And then I go on and to talk about how different race ethnicity groups have different job opportunities and economic opportunities in the US as a whole. And so there is this website here with a study about race and economic opportunity in the US. Raj Chetty, a professor in Harvard, he has this huge study. Now they changed this website more recently, which is called Opportunity Insights. And he has a lot of resources here. He has data that you can download, and also I want to see the list of papers, research list of papers. You have several papers that I have here on economic opportunities and racial ethnicity differences across the population. And based on this information here, in one portion of this study, the New York Times published this article here. When was that? A couple of years ago? In 2018. The New York Times, sometimes they put this information in really interesting graphs here. In this case, this is all data from that study. And they are showing people who grow up rich. So their parents were rich. And the blue dots here are Black boys, and the orange dots are white boys. And what are the chances of those white and Black boys, when they grow up rich, of continuing to be rich when they become adults, or becoming poor when they become adults? And overall, what you see is that the white men, they will have higher chance of keeping the children to grow up and stay rich compared to Black men. And that's controlling for a series of different variables. And the chances of the Black boys becoming poor is much higher than white men becoming poor. So this is just to show that there is still a huge issue of income inequality in the country by race ethnicity. And here they also show, in these graphs here, I put some of them in the lecture, kind of showing what's the percentile of income parents. So someone, for example, who is in the 80th percentile, all these people here are poorer than they are, and only 20% are richer than them. So these are people who were raised in these really wealthy households. And how do they become in the future? Most of the Black men, they will actually on average reach only the 52nd percentile. So there is a downward trend in their economic outcomes. While white men, they also overall experience a drop from the 80th to the 65th percentile, but their drop is much lower than the black men. So you have these huge disparities on the socioeconomic status of white men and black men when they are older compared to when they were children. And the disparities by race seems to be more significant among men than among women, okay? So you can read this article here and some of this, and here's the opposite way. People who grow up poor, what is the chance of them to keep being poor when they become adults or becoming rich? And if you let the data go all the way through, in the slides I let all the animation goes before I got the print screen, and you're gonna see a higher percentage of black men remaining poor and a higher percentage of white men becoming rich if they grew up poor, right? So that's a huge issue that the US still faces. Someone asked in the chat which lectures will be on the final. It's gonna be everything that we covered after exam 3 with internal migration and only up to international migration. I will not cover this discussion that I'm doing here right now about race ethnicity, right? And you can just go back into the lectures on YouTube to know exactly the slide that I started on. To be really specific, where's the syllabus? Behind the Zoom bar. You can go back there. So it's gonna be the content that I discussed from April 15 until today, April 29. And that's pretty much only internal and international migration, okay? This part that I'm showing here now about race ethnicity will not be considered in the exam. I just wanted to show you this here. The lecture on race ethnicity, it's subdivided here, pretty much saying like why demographers study it and how demographers have been capturing data on race ethnicity. So race ethnicity is important exactly because fertility, mortality, migration vary by race ethnicity, as we have been talking throughout the semester. Here, a little bit of a history of how race ethnicity categories were collected. Right now in the US, in the American Community Survey and also in the decennial census, you have two questions, one about race and the other one about ethnicity, in which you inform whether you're Hispanic or not. And you combine these two questions. But even if you go back to previous researchers back from the 1700s, the way that they classified population by race, it's really kind of like still similar to what it is now. Back in his book, Lino classified the population by colors as being reddish, sallow, black, and white, which pretty much represented the reddish American Indians, sallow Asiaticus, black Africanus, and white Europeans. And then Blumenbach, he added the brown category. And this categorization here, it's really similar to the categories that we still have right now: white, yellow, brown, red, and black, right? And so this influence of these previous studies, we say, oh, the studies become more complex and everything, but it's still the categories that we use right now of Hispanics, non-Hispanic whites, non-Hispanic blacks, non-Hispanic Asians, and non-Hispanic African Americans, Native Americans, sorry. They are really similar to the same colors that Lino and Blumenbach had, or mostly Blumenbach that added brown. Brown for Hispanics, white, black, yellow for Asians, and red for Native Americans, right? The first census in the US, we already discussed that in the lecture about sources of demographic data, was the 1790 American census. At that time, they just subdivided the census, like the number of people in each in each one of the areas in these 5 groups and broken down by sex and also by race ethnicity. 3 white males of 16 years and upward, 3 white males under 16, 3 white females, all other free people and slaves. And all this information that I'm getting here, I'm collecting them either from the textbook or the Census Bureau website. And this is a graph that I already showed to you as a result of the first census in the US, counting a total of almost 3.9 million people. And these are the totals in each one of these areas. And here, those subgroups, these 5 subgroups that I mentioned before, right? These 5 subgroups here that I mentioned in the previous slide. I mean, you have the 3/5 compromise in the US that pretty much the way that the number of representatives in the House was established was also based on race. And actually it gave Southern states 1/3 more seats in Congress and 1/3 more electoral votes than if slaves had been ignored. And it gave fewer representation if slaves and free people had been counted equally. So slaves were not counted as full people. And so that was, so it counted 3 out of every 5 slaves as a person. And that actually had major political impacts in the American society for the next decades and years. This is just to show how the information about race, ethnicity was captured since 1850 to 1950. And I collected this graph from the NPR website. All these things here I tried to get from different areas that shows you in a better way. So you had other white, Mexican, African-American, some specific categories of Asians as well. And American Indians started to be in 1950. 1970, the Hispanic origin question was added, ancestry question 1980, and some more changes afterwards. Some important things that I want to highlight is that the way that we analyze, we collect data on race ethnicity in the US is all based on this 1997 standard. And the Census Bureau was having this huge debate and spent a long time, a lot of resources to try to capture the information about race ethnicity in a more efficient way. And the Census Bureau was pretty much suggesting, instead of having 2 questions separated, race and ethnicity, they would be combined. So Hispanic would be one category within this combined race ethnicity question. And it would also create a category of Middle Eastern, North African to kind of see the increase or the trends of this specific subgroup in the US population. In the US Census Bureau did several different trials of questionnaires, how the questionnaire could be implemented in the censuses and also the American Community Survey. So these are questions separated by race ethnicity, combined, no Middle East and North Africans question, Middle East and North African questions, different ways to ask the question. And so all these squares here are different ways that the questionnaire could have appeared. And the ones that are highlighted here in blue are the ones that I show in the next slide. So this way here is the way that's been asked in these last years, Hispanic origin by itself, and asking origin, the term origin, like here, that's why we're talking about these terms, origin, ethnicity categories, and then afterwards the race of the person. And the Census Bureau said, oh, the best way to capture, and people actually answer the questions, don't leave it blank, is to put them all together. So Hispanic, Latino, or Hispanic should become a category of this combined question, and it would be called race or ethnicity, mark all boxes that apply, and it would also include Middle Eastern and North African. But the previous federal administration pretty much ignored all the study and effort from the Census Bureau and said, no, let's just keep the same way as it is. So the 2020 census still asks now the question separated, and here we do not have a separated question for the Middle Eastern and North Africans. And one interesting thing here in this slide, this is the questionnaire from 2010, and this is the questionnaire in 2020. And in 2020 is the first time that for the African American group, you don't use this term here. So it's crazy to think that up to 2010, this term was still being used. And only now in 2020, we just use Black or African Americans, okay? And yeah, it's 4:30. So I just wanted to go exactly into these slides and also talk a little bit about the inequality of opportunity. And those graphs that I showed from the New York Times, I put them here. So here's after all the animation finishes, that's the final result for those going down and for those going up, and also some other graphs here. And I make some summaries of the studies by Raj Chetty and his colleagues, okay? So anyone have a group me? Maybe we can group study. There is a group me already for this class, and the link to the group me is, I put the link as one of the announcements on Canvas. So if someone doesn't put the link here on chat, just go to Canvas. The link to the group me is in one of the announcements there that I gave back at the beginning of the semester. Thank you very much. I mean, 45 students, 2 students pretty much stayed here with me after the snowy storm, after February, crazy semester. It's not just a pandemic. Let's just put a snowstorm there as well. It's always challenge. Let's see how the fall is gonna be. Was a challenge, was cool. Everybody, if you have any questions, write me emails. I try to answer everybody in a timely manner. Submit your assignment 3 by the deadline, Tuesday, 12 p.m. and exam on Tuesday as well from 1 to 8 p.m. Thank you very much. Have a great summer. And yeah, hope to see you guys somewhere, somehow in the future. Yeah. Bye. Thank you.